The day was meant to be the happiest of his life. Adrian Knight, one of the youngest millionaires in the city, stood in the middle of a grand wedding hall decorated with golden ribbons, shining chandeliers, and flowers that filled the air with their sweet fragrance. Guests had gathered from far and near, dressed in their finest clothes, waiting for the bride and groom to step forward and seal their love story. Adrian had always imagined this day differently. He thought there would be laughter, joy, and memories that would stay with him forever. He thought the woman he loved would walk down the aisle, her smile bright and her eyes shining, ready to start a new life with him. But as the hours stretched, the smile on his face slowly faded. The music played softly in the background, the band waiting for the signal to begin the wedding march. Adrian's hands trembled slightly, but he told himself it was only nervousness. Every groom felt this way, he thought. He looked around at the crowd. There were his business partners, his distant relatives, old classmates, and even people who were barely connected to him but had come for the spectacle of a millionaire's wedding. Cameras were ready to capture every moment. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. The bride had not arrived. At first, whispers began to spread through the hall. Guests leaned close to each other, covering their mouths with their hands, murmuring thoughts they did not want him to hear. Some smiled awkwardly, others checked their watches, and some already started shaking their heads as if they had expected this. Adrian kept glancing toward the entrance, waiting for the doors to open. His heart pounded louder than the music. He tried to smile, to pretend everything was fine, but his chest grew heavier with each passing moment. Finally, one of his closest friends approached and whispered, "Adrian, she isn't coming." The words struck like a knife. For a long moment, he could not move. His eyes remained fixed on the doors, hoping that the statement was wrong, that at any second she would appear, wearing the dress she had chosen weeks ago, walking slowly toward him. But the doors never opened. The hall was filled with silence so heavy that even the sound of a dropped spoon on the floor echoed like thunder. One by one, the guests began to leave. Some gave him pitying looks, others avoided his eyes altogether. A few shrugged as if it was not their problem. Within minutes, the hall that had been filled with excitement and noise turned into an empty space of abandoned chairs and fading music. Adrian stood frozen in the middle, unable to believe what had just happened. The woman he loved had left him not just privately, but in front of the whole world. His reputation, his heart, and his dreams lay shattered on the floor like broken glass. The grand decorations, the costly flowers, the golden lights, all of it felt meaningless now. What was the point of beauty when joy had turned to sorrow? His chest felt tight, his breath shallow. He had been admired for his wealth, respected for his success, but in this moment, none of that mattered. He was not a millionaire, not a powerful man. He was simply a human being abandoned at the altar. In the distance, a few workers moved silently, cleaning up. They tried not to look at him, afraid of witnessing his humiliation. Everyone wanted to disappear, to leave him alone with his pain. And so they did. Everyone, except for one. At the far corner of the hall, a maid named Elena stood quietly, watching him. She was young but not noticed by anyone in the glittering crowd. She wore a plain uniform, her hair tied neatly, her hands still holding a small tray she had been carrying before the disaster struck. Unlike the others, she did not walk away. Her heart ached at the sight of Adrian's loneliness. She had seen rich men before, men who walked with pride and power, but she had never seen one standing so helplessly, abandoned by the very people who claimed to admire him. Adrian finally sat down on a chair, his shoulders heavy, his eyes distant. Around him, the grand hall felt colder than ever. It was supposed to be his golden day, yet it had turned into his darkest hour. He lowered his head, trying to hide his emotions, but the emptiness of the hall only made the silence louder. He wondered if anyone truly cared for him, or if they had only ever cared for his money. And in that painful silence, Elena stepped forward, unsure but determined. She was just a maid, but at that moment, she was the only soul who refused to leave him behind. The Golden Hall, once alive with chatter and laughter, now felt like a deserted palace. The flowers still stood in their vases, the chandeliers still sparkled, and the tables were still covered with fine cloth and untouched dishes. Yet none of it carried the joy it was meant to hold. Everything looked like a painting left behind after the artist had walked away. Adrian sat motionless in the center of it all. His suit, perfectly tailored and expensive, suddenly felt heavy, like a costume he no longer wished to wear. He stared at the ground, his eyes unfocused, as though he was looking at a life that had slipped through his fingers. Around him, the last of the guests departed. Some left quietly, not daring to speak. A few others muttered words of pity, but their voices carried no true warmth. Even those who once called themselves his friends kept their distance. They did not want to be connected to his humiliation. Adrian could hear the faint echo of their footsteps as they walked away. The sound of doors opening and closing reminded him that he was being left behind, one person at a time. Within minutes, the grand hall once filled with hundreds of people was nearly empty. The music had stopped. The band had packed their instruments. The photographers had taken their equipment. The lights still shone, but they lit up a room that had lost its purpose. Adrian lifted his head slowly, his eyes scanning the hall. There were still workers cleaning tables and stacking chairs, but none dared to come near him. To them, he was the man who had been left at the altar. The man who had everything money could buy, yet nothing that mattered when it came to love. A wave of bitterness washed over him. All the faces that had smiled at him hours ago were gone. All the people who had praised his success and raised glasses in his honor had vanished when he needed them most. He had offered them food, entertainment, and a story to tell, but when the story turned sad, they no longer wished to be part of it. Was I ever more than just a spectacle to them, he thought. He clenched his fists, not in anger but in deep sorrow. His dreams of a life with his bride had broken in front of everyone, and now his pride lay shattered too. It was then he noticed a faint movement at the edge of the hall. A young woman in a maid's uniform stood near the doorway. She was holding a tray with a half-empty glass, as if frozen in time. She had been there during the chaos, watching from the background, and unlike everyone else, she had not rushed to leave. Her name was Elena. She was not someone the guests would ever remember, but she had been part of the hall for years, working quietly to make sure events like this ran smoothly. She was used to being invisible, yet tonight she felt she could not disappear. Not when she saw the man in front of her sitting in silence, drowning in pain. Adrian noticed her too. At first, he felt confused. Why was she still here when everyone else had gone? Did she pity him? Did she see him as weak? But Elena's face showed no judgment, only concern. Her eyes, gentle and steady, seemed to say that she saw not the millionaire or the abandoned groom, but a man who was simply hurting. For a moment, their eyes met. Adrian quickly looked away, embarrassed by his vulnerability. He was not used to being seen like this. He had always been the strong one, the admired one. To be looked at with sympathy unsettled him. Elena hesitated before stepping closer. Her shoes made soft sounds against the polished floor. She placed the tray on a nearby table and held out a glass of water. Her voice was quiet, almost uncertain, yet filled with kindness. "You should drink something," she said gently. "It will help." Adrian glanced at the glass, then at her. It was such a simple gesture, so small compared to the grand things people usually offered him. But in that moment, it felt larger than anything else. She had not brought him business deals, promises, or empty words. She had brought him humanity. He took the glass with shaky hands. His lips barely touched the water, but the act of drinking steadied him. For the first time that evening, someone had cared enough to remind him that he was not completely alone. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Elena nodded softly. She did not press him with questions or try to comfort him with meaningless phrases. She simply stood by his side, a quiet presence in the emptiness of the hall. As the silence stretched, Adrian felt a strange warmth. It was not joy, not relief, but a faint spark of connection, something real, something he had long been searching for without even knowing. The hall was still empty, the celebration was still ruined, and his heart was still heavy with loss. But at least, in that moment, he was not abandoned completely. Someone had stayed. And though she was just a maid in the eyes of the world, to Adrian, Elena's simple act of kindness was more valuable than all the wealth and respect that had crumbled around him. The night grew colder, and the grand hall slowly emptied of sound. Only the faint rustle of workers clearing plates could be heard, but even they moved quickly, eager to finish and leave. No one wanted to linger around the man who had been left behind. It was as if Adrian's sorrow was too heavy for anyone else to carry. Yet Elena remained. She stood near him, her hands folded in front of her, unsure if she was crossing a line by staying. She was only a maid, after all. Her job was to serve quietly, not to comfort a millionaire. But her heart would not let her walk away. She had seen the loneliness in his eyes, the kind of loneliness that no money could heal. Adrian still sat in the chair, holding the glass of water she had given him. His gaze was fixed on the floor, his thoughts lost in the storm inside him. He wondered why the world had turned its back on him so quickly. He had given people everything: lavish parties, generous gifts, business opportunities, and yet when he needed them, none had remained. Except her. "Why are you still here?" he asked suddenly, his voice quiet but sharp with suspicion. Elena startled, but she answered softly, "Because I thought no one should be left alone tonight." Her words hung in the air. They were simple, yet they struck him deeply. For hours, he had been surrounded by people, yet never felt more alone. Now, in the silence, with only a maid beside him, he felt the faintest touch of comfort. He looked at her properly for the first time. Her face was not painted with makeup like the women at the party. Her uniform was plain, her shoes worn, her hair tied back neatly. But in her eyes, he saw something he had not found anywhere else that night: genuine kindness. "You don't even know me," Adrian muttered, shaking his head. Elena tilted her head slightly. "I don't need to know you to see that you're hurting." The honesty in her voice disarmed him. He tried to speak but found no words. Instead, he leaned back in the chair, exhausted. Elena took a careful step closer. "Would you like me to stay until you're ready to leave?" Adrian hesitated. His pride told him to refuse. He was a man who had built an empire, who never asked for help. But another part of him, the part that was broken and tired, longed for someone to simply be there. "Yes," he said at last, his voice barely audible. Elena gave a small nod. She pulled a chair from a nearby table and sat across from him, keeping a respectful distance. She did not try to fill the silence with chatter. Instead, she let the quiet remain, as if allowing him space to breathe. Minutes passed. The hall grew emptier, the workers finally gone. The chandeliers above cast soft light over the empty tables, and the scent of flowers lingered in the air. Adrian glanced around and realized they were the last two people left. Something about that made him strangely calm. For the first time in hours, he did not feel like a public failure on display. He was simply a man sitting in a quiet room, with someone who cared enough to stay. "You're not afraid of being seen with me?" Adrian asked suddenly. Elena looked at him with steady eyes. "Why would I be afraid?" "Because everyone else is," he replied bitterly. "They'll laugh about me tomorrow. They'll whisper my name like a joke." Elena shook her head gently. "That's their choice. But tonight, you are not a joke." You're just a man who was hurt. And everyone deserves at least one person who won't walk away. Adrian felt his throat tighten. He had been surrounded by empty compliments and fake loyalty for so long that he had forgotten what real compassion sounded like. Why would you care? He asked again, almost whispering. Elena paused, then spoke slowly. Because once, I was left alone too. I know what it feels like when the world turns its back. Her words revealed a quiet truth. She was not rich, not powerful, but she understood pain. And sometimes, understanding was more valuable than anything else. Adrian lowered his head, ashamed of the tears that threatened to fall. He had told himself he would never cry in front of anyone. But sitting across from Elena, he felt that perhaps it was safe to let go, even just a little. Elena did not reach out or try to touch him. She simply stayed, her presence a silent promise. At last, Adrian whispered, "Thank you, for not leaving me." Elena smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried no judgment, only warmth. You don't have to face this alone. The words echoed in his heart. They were simple, but they carried more weight than any speech given by the guests earlier that day. The night stretched on, but for the first time since his bride had abandoned him, Adrian felt that he might endure. The pain was still sharp, the humiliation still heavy, but a single light had been lit in his darkness. And it came not from wealth or grandeur, but from the gentle gesture of a maid who had chosen to stay. The days after the broken wedding were heavy and long. Adrian returned to his mansion, a place that once shone with life and luxury but now felt colder than stone. The tall glass windows reflected only his loneliness, and the wide hallways echoed with silence. He locked himself away from the world. The newspapers had turned his pain into stories, with headlines that mocked him. Business rivals whispered behind his back, and old acquaintances smiled only to hide their delight at his fall. Invitations stopped coming. Phone calls grew fewer each day. In just one moment, Adrian Knight had gone from being the admired groom to the abandoned man everyone secretly discussed. He shut the doors to visitors and told his staff to keep people away. The world outside moved forward, but inside the mansion, time seemed frozen. Adrian spent hours in his study, staring at the same page of a book without reading it. Nights were worse. He would lie awake, haunted by the image of the unopened doors at his wedding, the silence of guests leaving, and the feeling of betrayal that cut deeper than any wound. Food trays were often left untouched. Even the meals prepared by the best chefs tasted like dust to him. His body grew weaker, but his pride kept him from showing it. He wanted to believe he could endure alone. Yet deep inside, he knew he was crumbling. But not everyone gave up on him. Elena, the maid who had stayed that night, continued her work at the mansion quietly. She respected his request for solitude, but every evening she found small ways to check on him. Sometimes she left a tray of food near his door, other times she placed a fresh glass of water on his desk when he wasn't looking. At first, Adrian barely noticed. He was too lost in his grief to care. But slowly, he realized that someone had been making sure he didn't fall apart completely. The glass of water was always full. The food was always warm. And sometimes, when he was too tired to move, he found a blanket carefully placed on the back of his chair. He began to wonder why she cared. She had no reason to. He was her employer, and she was only a maid. She could have done her duties and walked away like everyone else, yet she stayed. One evening, as the sun set and painted the mansion windows with shades of gold, Adrian stepped into the dining hall. It was empty except for Elena, who was setting the table even though she knew he might not come. He paused at the doorway, watching her work quietly. There was no sign of judgment on her face, no trace of pity, only focus and care. For a moment, Adrian felt something unfamiliar, a sense of comfort. "Elena," he said softly. She looked up, surprised to hear his voice. "Yes, sir." Why do you keep doing this? He asked, his voice low, almost uncertain. Everyone else has turned away. Why haven't you? Elena set the plate down gently before answering. Because pain is not something anyone should face alone. Even if you don't see it, someone should still stand close. Adrian studied her words. They were simple, yet they reached him deeper than the polished speeches he had heard from his so-called friends. You don't even know me, he said again, echoing the question he had asked at the wedding night. I know enough, Elena replied softly. You are human. And humans need kindness. Adrian turned his gaze away, struggling with emotions he didn't want to show. His chest felt tight, not from sorrow alone, but from the strange relief of being understood, even a little. That night, he did something he hadn't done in days. He sat down at the table and ate. The food still felt heavy, but it was not tasteless anymore. Across from him, Elena worked silently, clearing dishes and pouring water, pretending not to notice the quiet change in him. For the first time since his world had collapsed, Adrian felt he might not be entirely alone. As days passed, Elena's presence became part of his routine. She never forced him to talk, but she was there, a steady light in his silent mansion. Sometimes she left small notes beside his food with gentle reminders like, please eat. You need strength. Other times, she placed fresh flowers in the hall to brighten the air. Adrian began to notice these details. And though his heart still carried deep wounds, he felt the smallest sparks of hope returning. The world outside still mocked him. The newspapers still wrote cruel stories. His rivals still smiled at his downfall. But inside the mansion, he found a quiet strength in the kindness of someone who had no reason to give it. Behind closed doors, where no one could see, a man broken by betrayal was slowly being held together by the care of a maid who refused to let him fade into the dark. The days turned into weeks, and though Adrian still carried the weight of sorrow, something had quietly shifted inside him. It was not joy, nor was it peace, but it was softer than the heavy silence that had once surrounded him. That change came from the quiet presence of Elena, the maid who never walked away. Every evening, she came with a tray of food, sometimes with a simple note, sometimes with just a gentle smile. She never pushed him to speak, but her patience created a space where words no longer felt like a burden. One night, the mansion was unusually quiet. The world outside was filled with the hum of cars and distant voices, but within the tall walls, only the sound of footsteps could be heard. Adrian sat in the study, staring at the fire in the fireplace. He held a glass in his hand, untouched, as his mind wandered back to the day of his wedding. Elena entered quietly, carrying a tray with warm soup and bread. She placed it on the small table near him and was about to leave when his voice stopped her. Elena, he said softly. She turned back. Yes, sir. Sit, he said, motioning to the chair across from him. His voice was calm, but there was something fragile in it, as though the words had cost him effort. Elena hesitated for a moment, then obeyed. She placed her hands on her lap, waiting, not wishing to disturb his thoughts. For a long moment, Adrian remained silent. His eyes stayed on the flames, his jaw tight. Then finally, he spoke, his voice low and uneven. I have spent years building everything people see. The company, the mansion, the fortune. I thought if I had it all, I would never feel empty again. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. But now I realize I had everything, and still, I had nothing. Elena listened quietly, her eyes gentle but steady. She did not interrupt, did not offer shallow comfort. She simply allowed him to speak. They loved me for what I could give them, Adrian continued. Parties, money, success, but none of it mattered when I needed someone. Not one friend stayed, not one family member asked if I was all right. The people who filled that hall with their cheers vanished the moment the music stopped. His grip on the glass tightened. And he stopped, his voice breaking slightly. He closed his eyes for a moment, struggling with the memory of the bride who had left him. Elena lowered her gaze, giving him the space to gather himself. Adrian let out a slow breath. Do you know what hurt most? Not that she left. Not even the humiliation. It was realizing that maybe I was never truly loved at all. The silence that followed was heavy. But unlike before, it was not the silence of loneliness, it was the silence of being heard. Elena finally spoke, her voice soft but clear. Sometimes people only see the surface. They see what shines and forget to look at the heart. But that does not mean your heart has no value. Adrian turned his eyes toward her. There was no pity in her tone, only truth. You are not the only one who feels that way, Elena continued. I have seen people turn away from me too. Not because of love, but because of status, or because they thought I was too small to matter. It hurts. But it also teaches us something important. When someone truly stays, it is not because of what you have, but because of who you are. Her words lingered in the air. Adrian felt them sink deep into him, breaking past the wall of pride and sorrow he had built. For so long, he had been surrounded by empty words. But this was different. These were words from someone who understood, who spoke not from comfort, but from experience. He looked at her carefully, his voice softer now. Why do you speak to me like this? You could do your work, keep silent, and no one would expect more of you. But you choose to say these things. Elena met his gaze calmly. Because I see a man who is hurting. And I cannot stand by and watch someone drown in silence when a few words might help them breathe. For the first time in weeks, Adrian felt his eyes grow wet, not from humiliation, but from the relief of being truly understood. He turned away quickly, hiding the emotion he was not ready to show, but his voice betrayed the crack in his heart. No one has ever listened to me like this, he admitted. Elena gave a small, warm smile. Then perhaps it is time someone did. The fire crackled gently between them, filling the room with a soft glow. Adrian felt something he had not felt since before the wedding, lighter, though still fragile. He leaned back in his chair, his voice low. Maybe I don't deserve it. Maybe I brought this on myself. No, Elena said firmly, her first words spoken without hesitation. Everyone deserves kindness. Even you. Adrian looked at her, surprised by the strength in her tone. For a maid who had always moved quietly, her words carried a power that reached him in ways nothing else could. That night, Adrian spoke more than he had in weeks. He shared not just his pain, but his fears, his fear of being unworthy of real love, his fear of being forever alone. And Elena listened, every word sinking into the quiet of the mansion like a promise that he was no longer unseen. By the time he stopped speaking, the soup on the tray had gone cold. But Adrian felt something warm inside him for the first time in a long time. He realized then that sometimes, healing did not begin with answers. It began with a heart that listened. Adrian woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through the tall windows of his bedroom. For weeks, mornings had felt heavy, as if the light itself mocked him. But on this day, the brightness seemed a little less cruel. He sat on the edge of his bed and took a deep breath, remembering the conversation from the night before. He had spoken more than he thought possible, and for the first time since his wedding disaster, he had felt lighter. Elena's words stayed with him, everyone deserves kindness. Even you. Those words had cracked something open inside him. Perhaps it was not weakness to lean on someone. Perhaps it was strength to admit that he needed help. Adrian dressed and went downstairs. The mansion, though still silent, did not feel as suffocating. In the dining hall, Elena was already setting the table. She looked up in surprise when she saw him enter, but she quickly smiled and continued her work. "You're awake early today," she said gently. Adrian nodded. "I thought I should try." She placed a plate in front of him without a word. He sat and began to eat, slowly but with more appetite than before. Elena did not comment, but her small smile showed she noticed. Later that day, Adrian went to his office for the first time in weeks. His company had been running without him, managed by capable employees, but whispers of his absence had spread. The moment he walked in, people looked up with surprise. Some hid their shock, while others quickly stood to greet him. Adrian kept his expression calm, though inside he felt nervous. His confidence had been shaken, but he remembered Elena's words and held his head high. He reviewed documents, asked questions, and gave instructions. By the end of the day, he realized something important: he still had the ability to lead. His pain had not taken away his skills, his mind, or his determination. That night, when he returned to the mansion, Elena was waiting with a tray of food. She noticed his tired face but also the faint spark in his eyes. "You worked today," she said softly. "Yes," Adrian replied. "It wasn't easy. But it felt good to try." Elena nodded, her expression filled with quiet pride. "That's how healing begins. One step at a time." Days turned into a rhythm. Adrian began leaving his room more often. He spent mornings in his office, afternoons meeting clients, and evenings at home, where Elena always made sure there was warmth waiting for him. She never treated him as a broken man or a fallen figure, she treated him as human. And that gave him strength. Slowly, Adrian began to see the truth about the people around him. Many who had left him after the wedding now tried to return, offering smiles and excuses. But he no longer saw them the same way. Their words rang hollow, their loyalty thin. He had learned that true care was not found in those who celebrated in his success, but in those who stayed in his silence. One afternoon, a business partner who had ignored him after the wedding came to his office with a wide grin. "Adrian, it's good to see you back. I always knew you'd recover quickly. We should discuss new deals." Adrian listened politely, but inside he felt no warmth. He realized this man had not checked on him when he was broken. His return now was not friendship, it was opportunity. That evening, he told Elena about it. She listened quietly as he explained how strange it felt to see people act as if nothing had happened. "They want your wealth, not your heart," Elena said gently. "But now you can see clearly who is real and who is not." Adrian nodded slowly. "Yes. And it hurts, but it also frees me. I no longer have to pretend with them." The more he spoke with her, the more he understood the value of honesty. Elena had no reason to impress him, no mask to wear. She spoke simply, truthfully, and it gave him courage to do the same. As weeks passed, Adrian noticed something new inside himself. The sorrow of being abandoned had not vanished, but it no longer controlled him. He began making plans again, not just for his company, but for his own life. He wanted to live with more meaning, not only to prove others wrong, but to prove to himself that he was more than one broken moment. One evening, he stood in the garden of his mansion, looking at the flowers Elena had carefully tended. She often placed fresh blooms inside the house, but here in the garden, he saw the true effort she gave, watering, trimming, caring for each plant. "Elena," he said softly as she finished her work. She looked up, surprised. "Yes, sir. You remind me of these flowers," Adrian said. "Quiet, steady, and yet you bring life to everything around you." Elena's cheeks grew warm at his words, but she lowered her gaze respectfully. "Flowers only bloom because someone notices them," she replied. Adrian smiled faintly. For the first time in months, it was a real smile, not one forced for appearances. He realized then that he was not only surviving, he was beginning to rise again. And it was not wealth, power, or reputation that gave him this strength. It was the quiet encouragement of a maid who had stayed when the world had turned away. The mansion looked different now. It was the same building with tall windows, marble floors, and chandeliers, but the silence that once haunted its halls was gone. Adrian felt it whenever he walked inside. There was warmth, not from the walls, but from the small details Elena brought into his life. A vase with fresh flowers on the table. A tray of food waiting when he returned from work. A voice that always said, "Welcome home," with simple sincerity. Adrian stood in his study one evening, staring out at the garden where Elena was watering the plants. Weeks had passed since he had returned to work, and people had begun to whisper again, not with pity now, but with respect. He had proven to everyone that he was not broken forever. He had shown strength, calmness, and focus. But deep down, Adrian knew the truth: he had not risen alone. Elena had been his anchor. He thought back to that painful wedding day, the laughter, the whispers, the betrayal. If not for her presence, he might have drowned in despair. She had asked for nothing, expected nothing, yet had given him everything his heart needed: kindness, patience, and truth. That night, Adrian invited Elena to sit with him in the dining hall. She looked surprised, for she was used to serving quietly and stepping aside. But he gestured firmly. "Please. Tonight, I don't want you to serve me. I want you to sit with me." Hesitant, Elena placed the tray down and took a seat across from him. Her hands folded nervously in her lap. "Is something wrong, sir?" she asked softly. Adrian shook his head. "No. Something is finally right." She looked at him curiously. He took a deep breath, his voice calm but full of feeling. "Elena, when everyone left me, you stayed. When I could not even stand, you gave me strength. You reminded me that I was more than my wealth, more than my pain. You gave me back my life." Her eyes widened slightly. She shook her head gently. "I did nothing special. I only did what any kind heart should do." Adrian leaned forward. "No. Many could have helped, but they chose not to. You were the only one. And I will never forget it." There was a silence between them, but it was not uncomfortable. Elena lowered her gaze, her cheeks touched with warmth. For her, kindness had never been about reward, but hearing his words filled her heart with quiet happiness. Over the next days, Adrian made changes in his life. He cut ties with those who had abandoned him without care. He built new partnerships with people who respected his integrity, not just his fortune. He also started projects to help the less fortunate: charities, scholarships, and shelters, because he finally understood what a single act of compassion could mean. Elena continued her work in the mansion, though her role slowly shifted. Adrian no longer treated her as just a maid. She was his confidant, his trusted companion. He often asked her opinion on matters, big and small. When people visited, they noticed her presence by his side, and though some raised their brows, Adrian did not care. One evening, as they walked through the garden, Adrian stopped by the roses. The night air was cool, and the flowers swayed gently in the breeze. He turned to Elena and said, "Do you remember what you told me once? That flowers bloom because someone notices them." Elena nodded quietly. Adrian's voice softened. "You noticed me when I was broken. You saw me when no one else did. And because of you, I found the strength to bloom again." Elena's eyes grew bright, but she kept her composure. "I am glad I could help you," she said simply. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. In her presence, he felt no need to hide, no need to pretend. She had seen him at his weakest and had not judged him. She had accepted him as he was, and in that acceptance, he had discovered his true worth. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth, had now become a place of peace. Every corner carried Elena's quiet touch, every day carried the memory of her care. Adrian no longer felt the emptiness that had once consumed him. One morning, as the sun rose and cast golden light through the windows, Adrian spoke with determination. "Elena, I don't want you to think of yourself as just someone who works here. You are far more than that. You are the reason I stand here today." Elena looked startled, unsure of how to respond. But Adrian continued, his voice steady, "People may see me as a millionaire. But the truth is, I am just a man who was lost and broken. And you brought me back." Elena's heart filled with emotion, though she said nothing at first. Instead, she bowed her head slightly, her eyes shining with quiet tears. "Then I am grateful," she whispered. "Because your life is worth saving." For Adrian, those words were more precious than all the wealth he owned. Time would continue to move forward, but he knew one truth clearly: he had been abandoned at the altar, mocked, and forgotten by many. Yet from that pain had come something greater, a bond with a kind maid who had shown him what it truly meant to be cared for. And so, his story did not end with betrayal. It ended with renewal. Not in riches or status, but in the quiet strength of kindness that had pulled him from the darkness into a new beginning.